A lone woman rescued a lost child in the highlands. 3 days later, a mysterious tribe appeared at her door. They say no good deed goes unnoticed. But in the frozen wild, where no one's watching and no one's left to care, some acts of kindness are answered not with applause, but with the thundering footsteps of 50 warriors at dawn. Welcome to Cracks of Light, where real stories echo like ancient legends, and every act of courage lights a path through the dark. If stories like this speak to you, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. Your support helps us keep bringing untold truths to life. Elena didn't ask for anyone's gratitude. She didn't even ask for company. After burying her mother at 11 and losing her father to a hunting trip that turned into a disappearance, silence became her language and solitude, her way of life. She stayed behind when the others left the northern ridges, refusing to sell the cabin her father built from pine and stone. People thought she was broken. Maybe she was. But she preferred being called stubborn. Life in the snow didn't scare her. It reminded her that feeling cold was better than feeling nothing. That night, the wind howled harder than usual, dragging the scent of iron across the fields. At first, she thought it was an animal. A wounded fox, maybe. But when she stepped out with a lantern, past the stacked wood and frost-covered tools, she saw the streak of blood in the snow. Not scattered, not wild, deliberate. Dragged. She followed it, boots cracking the thin crust of ice, breath caught between suspicion and instinct. At the edge of the ravine, half buried in snow, was a child. A boy no older than 7, his skin dusky, his hair matted and stiff with frost. He didn't flinch, didn't cry, just stared up at her with eyes that didn't belong to any language she knew. There were markings across his forehead, symbols painted in a muddy red. His leg was twisted unnaturally, his breathing shallow. She didn't think. She lifted him, carried him back across the field, into the warmth of a place he didn't recognize. She didn't know who he was, or why he was left to die on the edge of the world. But something in her hands, something in his silence, told her this wasn't just about survival. This was the beginning of something neither of them understood yet. And somewhere beyond the mountains, someone else had already noticed he was gone. Elena didn't sleep that first night. The boy's breathing was thin and uneven, and she kept checking for fever. His body was scratched and bruised, but what caught her attention the most was the mark. It wasn't just a scar or a scrape. It was something older, deliberate. Inked onto the skin of his upper arm, partially faded but still visible beneath the dried blood, was a circular symbol. A spiral wrapped inside a jagged outline, like a flame trying to escape stone. She didn't recognize it at first, but it felt strangely familiar, like something she'd seen long ago in one of her father's notebooks. Back when he was still alive, when he used to talk about the mountains like they had memories of their own. She cleaned the wound gently, careful not to startle him. Even unconscious, his body flinched like he was ready to fight. She didn't try to speak. Whatever language he understood, it wasn't hers, and words weren't going to help right now. He needed rest, food, and time. But something about the way his eyes had locked with hers earlier, just for a second, told her he understood more than he let on. By morning, he was gone from the cot. For a second, she panicked, until she saw him crouched in the far corner of the cabin, holding the cup of water she'd left nearby. He drank it in slow sips, watching her the entire time. When she placed a bowl of broth on the small table and stepped away, he didn't move. He waited. Only after she sat at the far end of the room and looked away did he crawl forward, grab the bowl, and eat like he hadn't tasted food in days. He didn't spill a drop. This became their rhythm. She left what he needed within reach, and he waited until she turned her back. He didn't speak, didn't cry, didn't smile. But slowly, the tension in his body began to ease. His hand stopped shaking when he picked up the spoon. He started sleeping more than 2 hours at a time. She noticed the way his eyes scanned the walls, the exits, the small knives she left out. He was trained, or at least taught to be cautious. Too cautious for a child that young. A few days passed. The snow thickened. Communication remained a silent game of gestures and glances. One morning, she stepped out to chop wood and saw something in the snow that made her skin tighten. A print, deep, clean, and perfectly circular. Too wide for a wolf. Too symmetrical for a bear. And most importantly, it was a single print. No leading trail. No path away. Just one mark near the cabin's back door. Like someone, or something, had been there, standing still, watching. She scanned the trees. Nothing. No movement. No sound beyond the usual groaning of pine trunks in the wind. But she knew what she saw. When she returned inside, she didn't mention it to the boy. Not that he would answer. Still, she noticed his shoulders tensed more that day. Like he'd felt it too. That night, she pulled one of her father's old boxes from under the floorboards. Inside were scraps of paper, pages of sketches and notes in messy cursive. The symbol burned into her memory, drove her search. She flipped past entries on snow traps and wildlife migrations, until she saw it. A drawing of a rock face, half buried in vines, etched with that same spiral symbol. Her father had circled it and scrawled a single word underneath, Aruka. She whispered it to herself, testing the sound. Then again, louder. The boy looked up, startled. His eyes locked on hers with a flicker of something, recognition or fear. She repeated the word, Aruka. His face didn't change, but his fingers clenched around the edge of the blanket. Elena knew the story, or at least the version told in town decades ago. A tribe that used to live deep in the northern woods. People who knew every route, every cave, every animal track. They healed with herbs before hospitals, vanished in storms no one else could survive. But they were driven out, accused of hiding weapons, of teaching outsiders how to disappear. The government called it a land reclamation. The town called it cleansing. Her father had called it a mistake. He used to say that the Aruka didn't die out. They just stopped being seen. Now one of them was lying in her cabin. She looked at the boy again. His breathing had slowed, but he was awake, watching her from under the blanket like an animal not yet sure if it was in a trap. She didn't ask questions. She just stood, walked to the table, and lit the second lantern, the one her father used to leave burning overnight when he was expecting company. Then she sat down, turned her back, and waited. The boy got up 30 minutes later, walked slowly to the table, and added a log to the fire. That was the first time she saw him do something not just for himself. In the morning, she saw the second print. This time, 2 feet, one after the other, at the edge of the tree line. He hadn't spoken in days, but he started drawing. Elena noticed it first in the soot smudges on the edge of the cabin table, short strokes, angled shapes, no pattern at first glance. Then came the actual marks. One morning while she was bringing in firewood, he took the blunt end of a charcoal stub and pressed it to the back of a faded feed invoice. By the time she returned, he had already retreated to his usual corner, and the paper was left neatly on the table. Not hidden, not flaunted. Just there, waiting. She picked it up and stared at the symbols. They weren't letters. Not like English or French or any language she knew. But something in her brain responded to the shapes. She'd seen similar strokes in an old notebook, her father's. The pages that used to bore her as a child now burned in her memory. Long walks through the snow, him mumbling about lost alphabets, spoken prayers that couldn't be written anymore. She rummaged through the drawer, pulled out the stained leather-bound journal she hadn't opened in years, and flipped through brittle pages until she found them. Notations from a conversation he once had with a man deep in the northern range. A man he never named. A man he said belonged to the mountain. There it was. A single line, underlined twice. Tama, meaning little fire. Her breath caught. She turned back to the boy, held up the paper. Tama, she asked. He didn't answer, but something shifted in his eyes, like a flicker behind stone. She tried again, gently. Is that your name? He didn't nod. He didn't run. He just blinked once, slowly, and for a moment, the tension in his hands relaxed. That was the first real answer she'd gotten. The name made it real. It changed the air between them. He wasn't just the boy with the mark, the silent shadow in her cabin. He was Tama now. A name with weight. A name with fire. She began to speak it around him more often. Tama, do you want water? Tama, this is warm. Tama, I'm not your enemy. And while he never repeated it, he stopped looking away when she said it. That night, after he'd finally fallen asleep, she stayed up rereading the old journal. It wasn't just field notes. It was memory. Her father had recorded stories of the Aruka, how they never fought to conquer, only to protect. How they had once walked alongside wolves, understanding their hierarchy. How they buried their dead beneath cedar roots, believing the trees would carry the voices of the fallen into the wind. Elena remembered a story he told her just once, when she was 10 and homesick with fever. He said a man once came to their cabin in winter, bleeding from the shoulder, clothes torn. Her father had bandaged him, fed him, said nothing. The man stayed one night, then disappeared into the woods at dawn. A week later, hunters came asking if anyone had seen an injured native. Her father said no. He never talked about it again. But the next spring, a leather pouch had been left by their door. Inside it were carved stones, a ring made of woven bark, and a folded square of fabric with a spiral burned into it, the same spiral now etched into Tama's skin. Elena held the journal tight, her hands shaking. Her father wasn't a romantic. He was a man of facts, of survival. But something about the way he wrote these pages, his handwriting messier, his words more urgent, told her this wasn't research. It was memory. It was truth. The realization hit hard. Her father hadn't just stumbled into a myth. He'd chosen it, protected it, and maybe, just maybe, paid for it. She looked at Tama, curled up near the fire, his hands still curled near his chest like he was shielding something precious. That protective pose, even in sleep, it made her chest tighten. For the next 2 days, she kept the journal with her at all times. She read him stories from it, not expecting him to understand. But every once in a while, his head would tilt slightly, as if a word had landed somewhere he couldn't reach but somehow remembered. He drew more. Simple things. A stick figure with a bird above its head, a set of wavy lines beside a triangle, then a shape that made her stop, 2 figures standing side by side, one larger, one small. Between them, a fire. It wasn't just a drawing. It was memory. His. She pointed to it. Me? She asked. Then to the larger figure. You? He looked away. But she saw it. The quiet acceptance in his face. They were forming something. Not a friendship. Not yet. But a pact. Still, the fear lingered. Every day she waited for someone to come down that slope. To knock. To accuse. But no one did. Not yet. And the longer she kept Tama here, the harder it became to imagine letting him go. But what disturbed her most wasn't outside it was the sense that Tama knew something she didn't. Something bigger than them both. That night, she found another paper tucked under the blanket. Not drawn with soot, but scraped into the parchment with the tip of a knife. A symbol she didn't recognize, an arrow that spiraled inward instead of pointing out. She showed it to him. He looked her dead in the eye for the first time and whispered a single word. Coming. Coming. Just that one word. Spoken quietly, but with a finality that didn't feel like a warning. It felt like a certainty. Elena didn't ask who or what. She didn't need to. There was no way a boy that age should have looked so sure, so hollowed out by something still ahead. But Tama wasn't just a boy. Not anymore. And whatever was coming, it wasn't random. It was following him. Or following what he carried. She started double-bolting the door. Not out of fear of Tama, but everything else. She cleaned the rifle, checked the oil in the lanterns, sharpened her father's hunting knife. It had been years since she thought of the world in terms of defense. But something had changed. This wasn't just a cabin anymore. It was a threshold. By the 3rd day, the snow started thinning, and so did the distance between them. Tama no longer waited until she turned her back to eat. He still didn't speak, not beyond that single word, but he listened more openly. When she lit the fire, he watched the process. When she placed her hand on a map her father had sketched decades ago, he came closer and tapped a part of the forest that hadn't been labeled. Just a patch of space, nothing on it. No trails, no landmarks. Just white. She circled it. Is that where you're from? He didn't respond. But he didn't pull away either. She began connecting the stories from her father's journal. Notes about a burial ground near a hidden waterfall. A legend of a spring that healed wounds when touched only under moonlight. Writings about Aruka customs. Ritual silence for children until their 7th winter. Markings to protect them from spirits. Offerings to the forest on the first snow. Things she once thought were folklore now fit Tama like a mold. His silence. His marks. His survival. And that's when she realized he wasn't running from something. He was being carried by it. Like a current. And she was now caught in it too. That night, he had another nightmare. The first since he'd arrived. He thrashed once, then froze, whispering something in a language she didn't recognize. Elena didn't touch him. She just sat by the edge of the cot and waited. He calmed eventually, but his face remained tense, like he was still there, wherever his mind had taken him. In the morning, he handed her a folded piece of paper. This one was different. Not scribbled. Deliberate. The drawing was of 2 mountains, mirrored. Between them, a sun, half black, half white. Below it, a path split into two forks, one line thicker than the other. She pointed. This, she asked. He nodded once. Then, for the second time, he spoke. Blood or circle, he said, slow, broken, but clear. She froze. What does that mean? He didn't answer. He turned away, picked up a piece of bark, and started scraping it with his fingernail like the conversation hadn't happened. That phrase haunted her for the rest of the day. Blood or circle? Choice or fate? Conflict or return? She didn't know. But it wasn't something a child made up. It sounded old. Passed down. That evening, she opened the smallest drawer in her father's desk. Inside was a yellowed envelope she hadn't touched in over 10 years. It was sealed with string. Her father had labeled it, "Do not burn. Unless they find you." She had thought it dramatic when she was younger. Now it made her hands sweat just holding it. She opened it slowly. Inside was a short letter. 3 pages, barely legible. Her father had written it in a rush, but the message was clear. He had known. Not just about the Iruka, but that someday, someone might come looking. He mentioned a name, Rael. Said if Rael's people ever returned, she should give them this stone with the spine mark. She didn't know what that meant, until she looked under the envelope flap and saw the pouch. Inside was a flat black stone, rough in texture, with a ridge down the middle like a scar. It had been there the whole time. She placed it in Tama's hand. He held it like he recognized it. Not shocked. Not curious. Just ready. You know Rael? She asked it. He nodded. Then, finally, he looked at her and said, Father. She exhaled, too fast, too loud. Your father? He nodded again, slower this time. A rush of understanding hit her. The man her father once saved. The one who vanished into the forest. Could it have been Rael? Could he still be alive? She stood, pacing. Are they coming for you? Or for the stone? She asked. Tama whispered, both. That was enough. She knew then that keeping him hidden was no longer about protection. It was about preparation. She began packing a satchel with dry goods. Laid out emergency gear, knives, her father's compass, her own maps. If someone was coming, she had to be ready to move. Or face them. But Tama didn't pack. He just sat there, still, like he was waiting for something that had already started. And when night fell, and the firelight cast long shadows across the room, he spoke again. They're close. She didn't ask how he knew. The way Tama said it, quiet, flat, with no edge of panic, made it clear he wasn't guessing. Elena moved instinctively. She doused the fire to reduce the glow inside the cabin, bolted the door again, and checked the rifle. It wasn't loaded to kill. It hadn't been for years, but she needed to feel it in her hands. She needed to remember how to defend something. Tama didn't flinch through any of it. He watched her with the same stillness as the mountains outside. Whatever was coming, it was familiar to him. She stayed up until well past midnight, every sound outside drawing her attention like a needle to skin. The wind carried no voices, no footsteps, only cold and weight. But there was something in the air, something old, pressing down on her lungs. When she finally dozed off in the chair near the door, Tama remained on the cot, eyes closed but clearly not asleep. At dawn, the cabin was silent. No footprints, no signs. But when she stepped out to check the perimeter, she saw it again. A single mark in the snow, near the tree line. The same spiral she'd seen in her father's journal, drawn not with ink, but pressed into the snow itself. Perfectly shaped, perfectly centered. Like a sign, like a message. She showed it to Tama without a word. He walked up to it, knelt down, touched the edge of the spiral with his finger, then wiped it away. Elena whispered, "Why erase it?" He stood and looked up at her. "Not for you," he said. She nodded. Understood. Whatever conversation was happening here didn't need her permission. Back inside, they sat across from each other. He drew another symbol. This time 2 circles overlapping, with a single line through both. She pointed at it. Another message? He hesitated. Meeting. When? He looked toward the window. Soon. There was no emotion in his voice. No fear. Just certainty. Like he'd accepted the entire process a long time ago. Elena felt it too. Not dread, but inevitability. The way seasons come. The way old trees fall. Not from weakness, but from timing. She opened her father's notebook one last time and read the final page again. His last entry had said, if they return, listen. Not with ears. Not with mouth. Only with fire. She didn't know what that meant before. But now, Watching Tama, she understood. Fire wasn't just heat. It was presence. It was will. The Iruka didn't speak in words the way others did. They spoke through signs, survival, silence. And sometimes, they spoke through children. That night, as she was preparing a meal of root stew, Tama approached her without prompting and held out the stone again. Then he placed it on the table, next to a folded piece of hide. She hadn't seen the hide before. It was tied with sinew, small enough to fit in a child's coat. She opened it slowly. Inside was another drawing, this one far older, etched into the surface like it had been carried for generations. A map, but not one you could follow with roads. It was symbolic. Spirals, mountains, trees, fire, and one word in the corner, rail. She pointed. That's him. Tama nodded. She touched her own chest. You want me to meet him? He didn't answer. Instead, he placed the stone over the name and looked at her without blinking. Why me? She asked. He shrugged. Because you stayed. She blinked, unsure if she had misheard. Stayed. He nodded again. Others left. You stayed. The simplicity of it landed hard. She had spent years believing her life was defined by isolation, by loss. But to him, to his people, that might have been a signal. A trait worth noticing. Later that night, as the moon rose above the pines, she felt it again, that shift in the air. Not cold, not heat, but movement. Life pressing in. She opened the door and waited. In the distance, fire flickered between trees. Not wildfire. Not random. Torches. Carried point 1, then 3, then 5. Silent. Controlled. She counted 12 before stopping. Tama stood beside her, no longer hiding. He looked older in the moonlight, like someone who had lived far longer than his years. She didn't ask what they wanted. She knew. He stepped out first, walked barefoot across the frost, each step deliberate. Elena followed, only to the edge of the porch. She watched as the torches stopped, forming a loose semicircle. No words were spoken. The tallest figure stepped forward, removed his hood. His face was painted in ash and charcoal. His eyes were not angry. They were tired, steady, and ancient. He looked at Tama first, then at her, then at the pouch in her hand. She held it out. He took it, examined the stone inside, and closed his fingers around it with care. Then he spoke, for the first time, in perfect, quiet English. Your father stood here once. Elena's breath caught. She nodded slowly. He saved someone. The man nodded. Me. She didn't know what to say. The words weren't hers to carry. He looked at Tama. You returned safely. Tama said nothing, just stepped closer and took the man's hand. Then the man looked back at her. You are not part of us, he said. But you are not forgotten. She stepped down from the porch, her feet crunching against the frost. He left you something else, she said, pulling the journal from inside her coat. The man took it, held it the way one holds a lost language. Then he said the word again, quieter this time. Fire. Then they turned, the boy and the man, and began walking into the forest. She didn't follow. She didn't need to. The boy had a name. The story had come full circle, but in her chest, something remained burning. And it would never go out. The fire had burned low when Elena saw the first flicker of movement between the trees. Not wind, not illusion. A torch, then another. Slow, controlled. They emerged from the dark in near silence. Figures wrapped in fur and ash, their steps synchronized like a memory being repeated. She counted 5, then 8, then more, all stopping just outside the reach of the cabin's front light. 50 in total, standing still, watching. Not a word spoken. Not a threat made. Just presence. Solid and impossible to ignore. Tama stood beside her, calm, like he had always known they would come. Elena didn't speak. She didn't reach for the rifle. She stepped down from the porch slowly, her eyes locked on the man in front, the tallest, marked by a necklace of woven bone and what looked like hawk feathers at his back. He took one step forward, then another. When he was close enough for her to see his face, he lowered his hood. It was the man from the journal, the one her father had written about, the one he had once saved. His face was older now, but the eyes hadn't changed, sharp, knowing, and full of history. He said nothing for a long moment, then nodded once at Tama. The boy stepped forward, placed the flat black stone into the man's hand, and stepped back without a word. The man closed his fist around the stone and looked at Elena. You are the daughter, he said. She nodded. Her voice felt caught in her chest. He said you might come. The man looked past her for a moment, at the cabin, then at the sky, then back. He kept his promise. And now you have kept his place. She didn't know how to answer that. It didn't feel like a role she chose. Just something that fell into her hands and wouldn't let go. I didn't know what he was doing, she said quietly. Not until now. The man gave a slight tilt of his head. Knowing is not required. Only doing. She nodded, unsure if she agreed, but understanding what he meant. Behind him, the others held still, some with eyes closed, some with heads bowed. They weren't waiting for her. They were waiting for him. He turned to Tama. Do you still remember the fire path? The boy nodded. And the circle, he said softly. That answer seemed to satisfy the man. He placed a hand on Tama's shoulder, then looked back at Elena one last time. You cannot come with us, he said. But you will not be forgotten. She didn't argue. She didn't ask why. Deep down, she already knew. This was not her world. She had been permitted a glimpse, and that was enough. She handed him the leather notebook, her father's final record, and he accepted it with both hands. Then he turned, the others parted silently, and the group moved like water back into the trees. 50 torches, moving as one. No voices, no goodbyes, just snow and breath and memory trailing behind them. Tama didn't look back. Elena stayed on the porch long after they had disappeared. She didn't cry. She didn't speak. But inside her, something settled. Not peace exactly, but purpose. She looked down at the porch railing where the boy had stood and saw a fresh mark, drawn in soot, a spiral within a circle. Their way of saying thank you. Their way of saying it's not the end. Just another turn in the story. The snow didn't fall that night. It just hung in the sky like it was waiting. Elena stayed by the doorway long after the torches had vanished, watching the darkness in case one of them returned. No one did. But something lingered. The stillness wasn't empty. It was charged. Like the land itself had witnessed what happened and didn't quite know what to do with it. She closed the door quietly, locked it out of habit, and turned back toward the center of the room where Tama had once sat. His blanket still held the shape of his last night there. His drawing sat untouched on the table. The overlapping circles with the single line, blood or circle, choice or fate. She didn't know which they had chosen, or if the choice had ever been hers to make. For the first time in weeks, the cabin felt too quiet. She wasn't scared. She wasn't relieved. She was aware. Aware that something had been given, and something else had been taken. She walked over to the hearth, reached into the ashes, and pulled out the small piece of hide Tama had drawn on before he left. She'd meant to leave it behind, to let their world go with them. But something made her keep it. That night she couldn't sleep, so she opened her father's drawer again. She hadn't noticed it before, but there was another compartment beneath the old fishing tackle. A shallow false bottom. Inside it, wrapped in cloth, was a letter. Her name written in his handwriting. She opened it slowly, half afraid it would change everything. It didn't. It just explained what she had already started to understand. Her father hadn't just helped a wounded man. He had protected an idea. That there were still people who remembered what it meant to live without conquering, to move without marking, to keep a pact older than borders. He said if she ever met them again, she'd know what to do, because the right path never shouts. It waits. It offers. Then it moves on. For days after they left, she stayed inside. Not out of fear, but out of respect. Letting the ground breathe. Letting the air adjust. But something tugged at her. A pressure that didn't ease. One morning, she followed it. No compass, no rifle. Just the old boots and a name. She walked toward the tree line where the spiral had been. Followed no trail, but trusted something deeper. And just before the sun hit noon, she found it. Not a person. A place. A hollow in the woods where the light bent just right. Where the air was warmer for no reason. And in the center, stacked with care, was a pile of smooth stones. On top of them, a bundle wrapped in dark hide. She opened it with trembling fingers. Inside was the notebook. Her father's notebook. Returned. But it wasn't the same. New pages had been added, stitched in with leather cord. Pages written in a language she didn't understand, marked with symbols she recognized. The spiral. The twin mountains. The fire. It was a message. Not written to her, but left for her. A way of saying, you held the story long enough. Now let it grow. She carried it home, without speaking. Placed it where it belonged. On the shelf above the fire, between the stones he brought back from the river and the compass he never used. That night she lit a single candle, set the spiral stone beside it, and whispered the boy's name once. Tama. The flame flickered like it hurt her. And though she never saw them again, she no longer felt alone. Because part of them had stayed. In the drawings. In the silence. In the fire. She didn't leave the mountain. Not because she was afraid of what lay beyond, but because for the first time, she understood why she had stayed. Elena didn't rebuild the cabin, didn't make changes. She just lived. Each day became a quiet ritual of remembrance and survival. Firewood. Water. A cup of broth for herself. A second bowl she kept placing on the table out of habit. Maybe not even for him anymore. Maybe for what he represented. Weeks passed. The silence returned, but it wasn't empty now. It was full of weight. Full of names, stories, and voices that didn't need to be heard out loud. One morning, she found a bundle at her door. No footprints leading to it. No trail away. Just a gift. Inside were dried herbs, a pouch of salt, and a small feather tied with red thread. Aruka medicine. She knew then that they were still watching. Maybe not from the trees, but from time itself. That spring, for the first time since her father disappeared, she stepped beyond the Riverbend Trail, the one they used to follow together but she had avoided ever since. The forest didn't feel like a threat anymore. It felt like a memory she was finally ready to walk through. She reached the stone circle they used to sit at, the one with the carved initials in the center. His initials. Hers. And now, she added another. T. 3 letters. 3 lives tied by silence, by choice, by fire. She didn't need to know what happened to Tama next. Whether he grew up to lead, or disappear, or become a name in the wind like his father. He had returned to his path. She had found hers. On her way back to the cabin, she paused beneath the old cedar by the ridge. Someone had placed a new symbol there, 2 spirals joined at the base. Not drawn. Carved. Fresh. Not hers. She didn't touch it. She didn't speak. She just stood there, letting the wind pass through her like breath. That summer, children from a neighboring village began hiking near her land again. They asked questions about the woods. About legends. About a boy in red paint who once lived with spirits. She didn't confirm. She didn't deny. She only told them this. Sometimes, what you think is lost is only waiting to return through someone else. They kept coming back. Some brought drawings. Others brought offerings. None asked her to explain the spiral stone on her table or the fire that always burned low, even in daylight. When they left, they whispered. Not out of fear, out of reverence. And on the nights when the sky cracked with wind and the mountains moaned like old bones shifting, she sat by the door, closed her eyes, and whispered his name once more. Tama. It never echoed, but it always landed somewhere. Somewhere deep. Somewhere still burning.